hosted by the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies. In this seminar, we are about to dive into the fantastic and imaginative world of design futures. My name is Lovisa, and I'm an advisor and futurist here at the Institute. And for those of you who are new to us, we are an independent, not-for-profit future think tank. And we work across the entire spectra of future studies with the aim to equip and inspire organizations and individuals to act on the future today. In this seminar, we will be introduced to the field of design future. It's a field that's gotten a lot more attraction over the recent year. And in this sphere of design future, we can find many different practices, such as speculative design, design futures, design fiction, critical design, and many more. And what they have in common is that we move from designing to what the world is, to what it could be. And I believe speculative architect Liam Young frames it quite beautifully when he says that these kinds of projects, they can become extraordinary images of tomorrow, while still sort of asking the right question of the urgent examination facing us today. Myself, coming from the field of architecture, a field with a long history of exploring ideas, ranging from paper architecture to visionary design, projects rarely even meant to be built, both engaging in an architectural practice that incorporate both imagination, speculation, and even utopian or dystopian notions. So to me, design future is a different way of approaching the world as an architect, how we design and influence it with our imagination. And when we think of design, I think we have a tendency to think of sort of problem solving, of ending up with a final product or experience or services based on the needs that we have today. And while future thinking, we are unfolding the many possible futures, the trends and drivers that are shaping the world for decades to come. And by combining them together, we are entering this exciting space where we, through futures and design, can explore new imaginaries, speculate on possible futures, and design an alternative present, and challenge and ask questions around how we lead our lives today. And to unfold this fantastical, speculative, and intriguing world of design futures, and hopefully even make the practice a bit more tangible, I am joined by two fantastic guests that work in the spectrum of design futures. Tobias Revell, Design Futures Lead at Arup, and Phil Balgatas, Design Director at Habitat and founder of Design Future Initiative. So to share how they approach the field of design futures, and how they use design and future together in their many shapes in their own work. There will be time for a Q&A, so remember to enter your questions in the YouTube chat. So I just want to say welcome. I think we have an exciting hour ahead of us, so I hope you will stay with us. And by that, I would like to welcome our first guest, Tobias Revell, Design Future Lead at Arup. Tobias Revell is an artist and designer, and his work spans many different disciplines, and his work has addressed the urgent need of critical engagement with material reality through design, art, and technology. It's great to have you, Tobias. I can't hear Tobias.
Just keep on going.
So while I wait for the sound to fix, I would like to ask you, what does design futures mean to you?
Can you hear me? I assume folks online can hear me. Okay. What design futures means to me? It's an interesting question. It's a useful bracket for putting together this idea that all design, all decisions we make today have impact into the future. Whether we do that knowingly and critically and engage with that notion, or whether we do it unintentionally, is an important part of the field of what you mentioned, which is critical design, which for me is really what the root of all of these practices are about, is about realizing that designers have an agency and an impact on the material world, and thus on people's experience of it and their sort of human everyday experience of stuff and policy and change in society and things like that. So design futures to me means that acknowledgement that all design is an act of future making in some way, and we can choose to use that actively to untangle some of the assumptions and biases we have about the future, which is what I'll talk about a bit.
Before you get to show some of your work, like when you talk to colleagues or clients, sort of what kind of misconceptions or misunderstanding about design future do you tend to meet? Like,
I think there's a sort of techno-optimism in human beings, which is probably relatively recent. There's an idea that the right technology will fix something, and that we are somehow indebted to technology for social change. And I think that's a massive misconception. It's not to say that technology is necessarily a product of society, but to suggest that technology is discrete or isolatable or on its own is independent of human intention and biases is a big assumption that people seem to make. Whether that's a sort of techno-solutionist mindset, a techno-optimist mindset, where it's very much about, maybe this technology like AI or whatever isn't perfect today, but in the future it will be. And that's something we've said about technology for as long as we've been working with it. That's a massive assumption that I think we're trying to untangle quite actively at Arup and get more into the way that social, political and cultural change is more important almost in getting to a better future.
So could you say that it's a way to, instead of like technology leading the future, it's a way for us to sort of achieve other aspirations instead of just being the solution?
Well, I think designers inherently have a systemic understanding of stuff, right? So they understand how cause and effect works, how people's intentions are embodied into materials, how certain behaviors are engineered or created. And that allows us to understand the way that society, technology, culture, myth, desire, narrative, all these sorts of things that make us human interact to privilege certain stories about the future above others. The world we're in at the moment privileges techno-optimistic stories, but we can use the same tool of design that creates that techno-optimism through hype and marketing and things like that to sort of untangle it, right? And show that maybe the solution isn't perfecting this terribly bad technology or developing the next technology, but it's sort of reconsidering who we are in the scope of the planet, for instance.
Yeah, okay. So now I'm actually going to hand over the presentation to you, and you get to introduce how you approach design future and Arup.
Sure, thank you very much. Right, I will hope that my slides are on the screen. They are, okay, right, let's roll ahead. So yeah, as Louisa said, my name is Tobias. I'm Design Futures Lead at Arup. I've been in that role for almost a year and a half now. And before that, I was an academic, really a design academic and educator, as well as running various small studios and things like that. But I've been enmeshed in this world of design and futures for about 10 or 15 years now. So just really quickly, an introduction to Arup. Arup is a global design, engineering, and sustainable development firm. It's almost 19,000 people now around the world, operating in 140 countries. And Arup's sort of pride is very much on its use of sort of social purpose behind our projects. So it's not just sort of cheap, fast solutions. It's all about projects that enhance the social and planetary well-being of the people and non-beings it interacts with. So famous projects include things like the Sydney Opera House, which is approaching its 60th anniversary. I can't remember the exact date that the ground was laid there, but it's coming up soon. La Sagrada Familia, which is the completion of Gaudi's famous cathedral, with using sort of machine learning to finish the design of these parametric spires, the Elizabeth Line in London, Marina Bay Sands in Singapore. But really, Arup operates across the built environment, and mostly what it does actually is infrastructure. So although it's quite famous for these big sort of mega buildings and mega projects, most of what it does is things like energy, water, resources, data infrastructure, that kind of stuff. Yeah, as I said, about 140 countries, over 18,000 people operating all across the world. I'm based in the head office in London, where the Foresight team is situated. And Foresight has these sort of aims for the company. So the first one is to envision, enable, and empower equitable and sustainable futures. Second one is to influence positive change. The third one is to challenge and inspire Arup and the industry to think beyond today and engage in alternative and critical futures. I'm really pleased that we got critical in there. And finally, to drive futures literacy and critical thinking for Arup, our clients, and our networks. This is what the team in Foresight looks like. So what's important here, I think, and what sets us apart from a lot of Foresight teams is we've got on the right-hand side there a design team that work in tandem with the analyst team on the left. So our analysts come from everything from transport planning to urban planning, climate policy, all sorts of things. And then the designers coming from, illustration, architecture, all sorts of different backgrounds, all work together on projects, right? It's a design-led approach to thinking about the future, which means that we embed things like story, narrative, human experience, material culture, and things like that into the way that we think about the future. It's not just based on data and sort of computational analysis, for example. It's based on stories and ideas and narratives. And this sort of is this visualization we're developing of how we work. So we have sort of two halves to what we do. We've got an advisory half, which very much looks at client work, and that is usually or most often internal clients. So our biggest client is obviously Arup itself. So other parts of the business ask us for input. And our second part is external clients. So where an external company approaches us and asks us to do some research. And then the other half of this is the lab, which is more self-initiated work or things that we're doing in response to bigger strategic pieces from Arup. And around the outside there, you can see this relationship between design and analysis as being really crucial to that, right? The analysis on its own doesn't create meaning. The design on its own doesn't create meaning. It's these two things working together that create meaning and value in our projects. So a lot of what we've done historically has been in the format of reports. All of these sorts of reports are online and able to be accessed for free, and they're all looking at sort of urban configurations and scenarios, I suppose. But there's also a growing interest in other forms of engagement. So, the report in the world of advisory and foresight will probably always have its place, but what can we do to really push the ways that we're engaging people, especially as our major concern is 1.5 degrees. That's what we're all here to do, is to try and limit the worst impacts of climate change as best as possible through whatever means possible. And are there better ways of doing that than reports? Or are there other ways of doing it that supplement and complement our reports, which is what I guess I'll get into. And I think an interesting thing, going back to that critical futures, is something we're really aware of is this growth of critical futurism. And I love this quote from Frederick Jameson. If you're in the futures world and you haven't read this, then stop right now, pause and read this, and then come back, because it's an amazing piece, Progress versus Utopia. And he says he would argue that most characteristic futures work, under which he brackets in the vein of critical futurism, not only foresight and research and things, but also science fiction, journalism, marketing, anything that sort of deals in the future, does not seriously attempt to imagine the real future of our social system. Rather, its multiple mock futures serve the quite different function of transforming our own present into the determinate past of something yet to come. And so for me, and maybe we'll get to this in the discussion, the value of design is in it untangling this determinate future, right? And reshaping our perception that some sort of future is inevitable, someone else is going to make it, whether it's a marketer or Silicon Valley or whatever, and we're just sort of structured into this linear path, what a scholar called Romich calls a trans-historical continuity, in which we're disempowered by being placed on an inevitable timeline of future progress. And I'm very interested in how design can really challenge that assumption. And we can see the need for this in real life. I mean, if you Google robot, the word robot, or ask most people what they think about when you say robot, this is probably what comes up. A Google image search is a legitimate form of quantitative research. And they're usually metal androgynous humanoids who look like this, and there's usually a blue is the more recent color for data and visualization and interface. It used to be green and things like that, but the truth of it is that our robots tend to look very different. So as well as our Roombas and our Amazon Echoes and our Siri on your phone and everything else, or even the ChatGPT interface, Paro by Paro Robotics is probably one of the best known articulated robots, in that it responds to touch, it sort of moves, it warms up, it purrs, it makes eye contact, all sorts of things like that. It's a robot that was developed to do effective labor for folks with dementia and Alzheimer's in Japan, where there's obviously an aging population problem. So it's interesting. The role here of design is to say that the assumptions that we take into thinking about the future, the inevitable future that we've been told is coming since the 1920s, when Karel Čapek first invented the idea of the robot, the sort of literal metal serf or slave, I think it directly translates as, is really challenged by what we actually need and who we actually are as social beings. And, in this case, it's elder care and not having good enough care for our elder folks. So I want to talk about two projects, conscious of time, one of which is very much in that realm of speculative design, and the other, which is maybe more a straightforward use of design to balance the idea of telling a story and communicating some data and information. So for London Design Festival in 2022, we looked at the work we're doing on regenerative design, which is this idea of a design paradigm where you are sequestering more carbon than you're putting into the world through a design, or you're restoring natural ecosystems. So it's a sort of carbon positive or maybe carbon negative, depending on who you read, approach to the built environment. And we're doing a lot of work around what that means and how we can start to transition Arup and our clients into that world over the next sort of 30 years or so. But it doesn't tell us much about what life is actually like in this world. So what we wanted to explore in the Foresight team is, okay, well, let's say we're in a regenerative future. What are the trade-offs we've had to make? What are the new inconveniences that are in our world? What do we eat? How do we travel? Who do we hang out with? What do we do for work? That kind of thing. So we created a 9-minute short fiction, design fiction film. I'm not sure if it's going to play or not. I don't have full control over it, but I can share the trailer afterwards, that follows a day in the life of someone in this regenerative future as they go about their day. And there's lots of details in there that really start to bring it to life. So there's things like the fact that, oh, there you go, the next button presses play. There's things like the fact that she has to wake during sunrise because there's less artificial lighting in order to allow the birds and various fauna to restore in London. She can only travel a limited distance because there isn't so much even availability of public transport given the constraints on power use. They eat as a community because it significantly lowers their carbon impact with the more people you cook for. And there's all these sort of details that bring this world to life. It's not just a perfect utopia. It's not that we've solved all problems, that climate change has been reversed, that the crux of the story is a flood, a devastating flood of London. And so it's all about teasing out what the real experience of life is like. We presented this at London Design Festival. We hosted a day-long panel, which is really important to engage in sort of public thought leadership around this idea. Worked with a load of partners on sort of getting some really interesting products and experiments and tests that we could use in the film to sort of flesh it out and bring it to life. Showed these in an exhibition. This is one of my favorite pieces, which is a project called Thames Glassware by Lulu Harrison, which is glass made from recycled glass extracted from the Thames. And all these things add up to this sort of story of what a regenerative future starts to look like. Last week or the week before, we did a Berlin version, which is called Common Ground. In London, the future is probably a bit wetter, and in Berlin, it's probably a bit drier just because of the microclimate. And so we looked at the same sort of design principles and design ideas, but what does this future in Berlin start to feel like, and how does that come to life? The second project I want to talk about is not so much a speculative futures project, but is more a straightforward design project in a way. Sorry, my computer's not enjoying this app. Which is 131030. And this is a plan for a roadmap for the future of sustainable development at Arup. And the idea here is that we have, thanks to our amazing team of analysts, some incredible access to some great data on what the next 30 years starts to look like. So what are the sort of key milestones? What are the trends in the data across biodiversity, circularity, human development index, temperature change, things like that? What are the upcoming events we can be sure of? Like, when does the world hit 9 billion? What are the ones that are more flexible, like peak oil? How can we start to map these on what is quite, in a way, a traditional foresight roadmap? But how can we also use it as a provocative tool? So not only is it a piece which is aimed at doing a straightforward data visualization and being something that business leaders can use for strategic planning, but it should also be something which, going back to what I was saying earlier, really challenges people. The reason why it's called 131030 is that, much like a lot of businesses, our planning cycles are every 4 years. So the next planning cycle is in a year, and then there's impact over, also the implementation over 3 years, and the impact over 10 years. And what we're trying to say here is the decisions that are made today will roll out over the next 30 years of this horizon. Like, they'll keep going out. So we're really early stages of this project, and it's really exciting because it's a great design project in the sense that there's a very clear brief of what we're trying to do, but it's a real balance between very scientific, very rigorous, very rich data, and something that really starts to tell a story and starts to give an impression of what the world of sort of like, I don't know, 2035 might be like. What are the events that might be occurring at that point? What are the concerns of the company going to be at that point, and how do we need to adapt to them? We also use this stuff all the time in client work. It's just a really simple example of something we sort of did live in a workshop with a client, where we took some of the ideas that they'd drawn out as concerns for a future city, and we started to say, well, those are quite abstract. What does daily life start to look like in this city once you've got different signage, different lifestyles, different newspapers, whatever it is, different infrastructure? Like, how do people move around this future city? And that becomes a really useful tool for engaging them, not only in the data and the story, but also what it feels like to be in the future, which is really what design can bring to the party. And that's it from me. I think I kept the time. That's pretty good.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much. It was super interesting to hear about your work, and I was thinking maybe you could elaborate a bit more on, like, when you do these kinds of projects, like, how do you balance, or it might not be a balance, but how do you balance the research and data with the need for, like, being speculative and use creativity and imaginations within the product? Like, how do you find that balance so it doesn't become over imaginative but still intriguing, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of, well, there's two answers to that. The first is, I'll say that all design is research, right? I'm an academic, so I'm sort of believe in this idea that when you are a designer doing design, you are doing research, right? You don't have to read a paper and then write about it to be doing research. Like, the very act of making something is a form of research. And in the case of that film, we took some of the top level principles about what a regenerative world might feel like, and then ran them through a day in the life, almost like a speculative user journey. That then feeds back into the report, right? That becomes a form of research, because we can say, okay, well, we should investigate more like transport, because people are going to need to get around, and we don't have enough there, for instance. The second part of it is there's lots of cues to look out for, and you get used to it over time. I taught this stuff for years as well. Like, there's sort of science fiction cues. As soon as someone says there's a pill that ... you're like, well, that's just science fiction, right? Or you have limitless energy. That's science fiction. The trick is, and the value of it is in showing the trade-offs that people have to make, right? No life is perfect. We might get rid of cars, which would be amazing and save a lot of lives, but it would mean you couldn't travel as far as easily or independently. And that's the sort of nuance of doing the work, is bringing out those not contradictions, those trade-offs that people have to go through in their sort of material lives in order to experience things. And that's what separates it from pure fantasy or science fiction, where there's good science fiction that does that. To be fair, that's unfair on science fiction to say that it's just fantasy, but it's what separates it from fantasy.
So could you say that through the different sort of mediums you work with, whether it being videos or exhibitions, there is an idea of leaving something behind with the audience or the visitors, it being provocations or evoke emotions and inspire actions? But how do you make sure that they are actually leaving with something within your project? Like, how do you do that? It might be an open question, but yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's the idea. I mean, all of the above, provoke a response. Actually, what's really interesting, for instance, about the Abundance Project is not everyone liked it. Some people thought it was a real dystopia. Some people thought it was a utopia. Some people were in the middle ground and wanted to have a discussion about it. And that itself is interesting, right? As a form of research to understand things. I think I have a reluctance, as a lot of sort of design researchers do, to develop a rubric for assessing the impact of design, because then it undermines its quality, which is that it's not another data-based quantitative metric of change or success. It's something that is in the zone of sort of causal layered analysis. It's building the mythos of culture, right? It's building narratives, it's building stories, it's building things that we believe. We know from many studies, from causal layered analysis and critical future studies and others, that people make decisions based on the things they believe, more than just hard data and so-called objective fact. So tapping into that, tapping into a zeitgeist, tapping into the storytelling mechanisms of society is really important. And I suspect if you tried to make that measurable, you undermine the power of it.
Yeah, but how do you, when you have these images or projects, and so, because I believe that future as a field is still quite limited, or it's quite sort of, it's for the few, right? So when we work with this kind of projects, how do we make sure that we include a lot of different perspectives and not only sort of continuing with our own ideas and our own belief systems and assumption about what the future might look like? Like, how do we sort of open us up to be a bit more sort of inclusive in our work?
It's a very good question, and other scholars have written about that better than I could. Like, I'd recommend Pedro Gil Fajaras's work on participatory speculative futures as a really good example. I mean, a straightforward answer to that, for instance, is with the Berlin version of that project, and we're starting a Singapore version as well, is we workshop it with local folks. So working with those artists and designers who are from the area, who are really engaged in the communities there, whether the communities of design or activist communities, working with our experts in Arup who know more about the sort of the science of what's going on within that area, to make sure that we really become, you know, in the words of how Stuart Candy puts it, we become facilitators of the future making, not the sort of authors of it so much. With London, we're all Londoners, so that was quite straightforward. But with the others, it's really much about developing a framework where you can get those ideas together, steward, if you like, other folks through a process of authorship and writing, and then help to articulate it for them using design skills that maybe aren't present there.
I really like that sort of being facilitators than the writers. I think that's a very sort of good sentiment to have as someone working with the future, that we should sort of help or like at least sort of explore it with a lot of different input.
I mean, personally, I think there's a balance, right? This is a real personal bugbear for me, is I think a lot of participatory work, for me, the role of Design Futures is to provoke a response and to challenge people's assumptions and to really get them to think about things they may be uncomfortable thinking about in a way that's well facilitated and as safe as possible. And my worry with a lot of participatory work is you end up with the thing that's least offensive to the most people, right? And that sometimes undermines the point, which is you end up with the lowest common denominator project. And I've seen some excellent participatory futures projects, and I'm not going to reel them off here, but you know, things like Extrapolation Factory, Stuart Candy, I mentioned earlier, various others. But then I've seen a lot that are just really terrible because you've got a lot of people in a room to agree on the thing that they find least offensive amongst them, and that it can be poorly facilitated and result in something that doesn't do what it's meant to do, which is to challenge folks to think beyond what they're comfortable with.
And I think with that, we need to move over to the Q&A from our audience. So we have a question from Eli, and she asked, how do you backcast from your future scenarios to concrete actions and measures in the present and midterm? From your experience, what is the most challenging in this?
It's a good question. I mean, we have lots of different methods. We as a Foresight team, we use sort of a lot of Foresight methods I think folks would be familiar with, like morphological analysis and things like that. I think when it comes to something like 1-3-10, where there is an element of implicit backcasting, that's more, I suppose, a case of getting people to understand what I was talking about at the beginning, which is that systematic connection between things. So, for instance, if you're a leader in, let's say, Arup's water business, you know, you may be focusing on what are the upcoming technologies and policies in water and things like that. You may not be considering the lack of sand in East Asia for new construction, right? And the impact that the removal of sand from certain beaches is having on the changing of tides and therefore the water going into things. But we can start to map that out. And so a backcasting exercise sort of starts to loop those things together and show all these systematic interconnections. But in terms of, how we do backcasting for a normal Foresight project, for a straightforward Foresight project, then it's, tools that I'm sure folks are familiar with. Things like the seven implications and things like that, the 7 wheels.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question before we end this conversation. We have a question from Marco. He asking, I'd like to know if in the work you have done, there was room for considering multiple scenarios. And if so, what was the process of narrowing them down in one integral preferred version?
To refer to those 2 projects again, yes, for abundance, there were various scenarios we looked at, and we looked at lots of different types of future. We obviously wanted to look at this idea of regenerative design, and that doesn't have a particular future, but we also wanted something that would connect with the type of audience we would expect at London Design Festival, who are maybe younger, engaged in material culture, broadly aware of some of the issues we're talking about already. So that was the narrowing down by thinking about who the audience was. With 1-3-10-30, I didn't maybe say it, but that is actually 3 scenarios. So 1-3-10-30 tracks 3 parallel scenarios. The first being the 1.5 degree SSP1 scenario, which is what we're calling a livable and resilient world. Then there's the middle one, which is sort of the trajectory we're on at the moment, which is 2.2 to 2.7 degrees of warming and a degraded planet. And then there's 4 plus, which is, nightmare hellscape, basically, which is sort of the very top of it, where things go drastically wrong and we don't make any cuts at all. And so that's how we do that and how we narrow those down. I think a big thing with scenarios is always thinking about audience and impact. That may not seem particularly insightful, but who are you trying to talk to and what do you want them to think about? And it's that simple of like narrowing it down. Scenarios are fickle and fallible, and only expose a small part of that future's cone. So what's most useful for the conversation you're trying to host with the client, or what you're trying to get them to think about, really is always the question. And with 1 through 10, it's like, this is the best case, this is the worst case, and this is the most likely case. And it was that straightforward.
Okay, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you, and I will ask you to stick around to the end after Phil's presentation, and then we will have a little conversation, the three of us. So with that, I would like to welcome our second guest. We are joined by Phil Balagtas, Design Director at Habitat and founder of the Design Futures Initiative. And Phil has spent the last 20 years designing digital products, and the last decade thinking about the future. It's great to have you.
Hi, thank you.
So you've been working within this field for quite some time. So what sort of piqued your interest in moving from, I guess, product design to the more sort of future thinking aspect of design?
I still feel like I'm pretty new to this field because I discovered it through speculative and critical design while doing my master's in 2009. And I was very fascinated with the future, but I had only known about the future through literature and media and film. And when I discovered some of the work coming out of the Royal College of Art from Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby, I was really interested in what that was and the methodology. And I basically tried to understand what it was, and I used it as a platform for my thesis. And then I didn't really get quite the response that I thought I was going to get when I gave my final thesis, and I kind of put it away, and I went and became a designer in Silicon Valley working on software. And then it wasn't until 2015 that I sort of resurfaced that work and started the meetup and really started to look at it as a strategic process. I thought it was very powerful as a vehicle for looking into the future, but I was trying to figure out how can we actually reframe it in terms of, I guess, product and service design. Can we actually use these methodologies to think about the future and also think about other really important aspects like policy and ethics and future behaviors and ecosystems?
So before we because you're going to show 2 projects that you've done at your time at McKinsey, but before you sort of get to show them, it would be great to hear how speculative design actually was introduced at McKinsey. How did you intrigue them to actually sort of start doing these kinds of projects?
Well, I think that's actually the basis of the story, and I can actually walk you through that process through the slides. But I kind of want to start with this, if I can advance a slide here, quote by Cameron Tonkin-Wise, because when I was trying to define or understand what critical design was, and then also discovering all the other types of speculative design, including interrogative design, adversarial design, discursive design, ludic design, it became very confusing. And then I ran across this article where he said that he was basically trying to debunk that all these phrases are redundant and appropriative of design, and that really design that doesn't already think about the future, whether it's the near or the far term future, isn't really adequately designing. And so that was, even though I was sort of trying to advocate and promote speculative design as a strategic process, it was useful to kind of look at it, also step back and look at all these as just kind of a design process. And it might be a little bit provocative to some, but as I've investigated it and used it over the years, I've kind of felt like and I know it's not this binary, that there's sort of design for provocation and there's also design for strategy. And it's not that either one, they're not mutually exclusive, but I've been trying to make sense of how to make this practical for my work as well and for other people in my community. But I'll go ahead and start just kind of telling you guys a little bit about my background. So I was trained as a print designer. I was supposed to be designing magazines and books back in the early aughts, but I graduated the print degree, but ended up being a web designer. And so I've been working in digital products and services for most of my career. And it wasn't until like 2007 when I moved to San Francisco, and where I started, I really had an urge to get more education. So I entered a master's program, and that's where I discovered speculative design. And then I went back into the industry and started working on more software and more digital products and services. I worked for General Electric for a little bit. I was both a lead interaction designer there, designing software dashboards for large power plants, and eventually made my way as a design director in the aviation digital unit. So again, still working with dashboards and big data and analytics, that kind of stuff. And then joined McKinsey, I think around 2017. I spent about 3.5 years at McKinsey, but all the while, I'd started the nonprofit and the community. Like I said, in 2015, I started a meetup in San Francisco, which was just an experiment really to see if we could continue to share this work and talk about it and try to figure out the methods and frameworks around it. And that grew very quickly. In 2018, we had 6 chapters around the world. And then literally in about 2 years, we'd grown to 60. And I think today there's over 80 chapters around the world. And it was a lot of it was kind of timing, right time, right place, but also just this kind of, it just kind of spread by word of mouth around the world. And it was great just to have so many people who are interested in this and experimenting and sharing their work. And at the same time, so I was balancing that on the outside and then trying to slowly bring it in through a Trojan horse methodology, kind of smuggling it into the design process at both GE and McKinsey. But when I first started at McKinsey, it took me about a year to really understand where, when, and how I would introduce this process. There wasn't anyone that's practicing Foresight or Futures there, but I knew I wanted to bring it in. I mean, they are one of the largest business strategy consulting firms in the world. And I had to kind of find allies. And I found a designer who was doing a biweekly trend report named Charlie Hartzell. And we sort of teamed up. I introduced him to the process, showed him a lot of examples. And we decided the first way we might want to introduce it to was through the design community, the internal design team. So we created a newsletter and literally just did this in our spare time as a way to just kind of provoke and introduce the process. And we called it Signals in Design. This was the first issue, which was back in 2019. And all the while, that first year, I really kind of spent just kind of trying to understand what was the culture like, what was the vocabulary they were using, how could we actually position this in terms of our process, and how could we maybe eventually turn it into an offering. But that wasn't really the goal. The goal was to see if we could start to practice it in some way. And we weren't really sure what the impact was going to be, so we just sort of tested it out. And this is pre-pandemic. He was looking at trends and just kind of gathering it from desktop research. And we had created this issue around something we called the hyper-nomadic lifestyle, which was kind of fusing digital nomadism, minimal living, and kind of renting of personal goods. This is something that we were seeing as trends in the market where places like IKEA, I think over in Europe, you could actually rent furniture. So you could just rent it and give it back. So we thought, what if these 3 types of signals collided, and as people start to be a little bit more nomadic, could you rent your services and bring your insurance and your visa around with you as you move around the world? And now we can see, as instigated by the pandemic, this is actually more of a case. Not that we're saying that we predicted the future before it happened, but it was interesting how that sort of played out. But we started by trying to decide, like, how do we create an ecosystem of products. And this looked a lot like some of the work that we were already doing in service design. So we got some illustrators to illustrate some of the ideas of, like, what does it look like to be a hyper nomad? And that was just kind of internal. And we got a little bit of, we got some good responses from it and some other interest. And so we said, okay, we're going to do another one, but we're going to step it up a notch. And we were trying to figure out where we're going to get some of the data for the next issue. And one of the business analysts that we were working with was working with McKinsey Global Institute, which is their research arm. They publish a lot of really, really great reports. And they just published a report on digital identity. It's a massive report. And we pitched the idea of having them collaborate with us on the next issue, focused around digital identity, but also focusing on a number of other signals. So we did that work, but we also had to figure out, like, how are we going to discuss what the process was? And we felt like one strategy would be, let's not make it feel like it's this completely other isolated process and not use the words fiction or speculative, because we thought that might be a little bit triggering, either internally or for our clients. So we tried to map out what sort of the fundamental methods and frameworks were for us to get to a strategic outcome of some sort. And we drew this chart and we kind of mapped it to a traditional design thinking process, which should include research and concept design and then landing and strategy. And this sort of became the template for what eventually became an offering later on. But this was just sort of to kind of expose the sausage making, expose what the process was going to be like, and show there was some rigor involved. There was research, both quantitative and qualitative, and it looks just like what we're doing today. So, there shouldn't be a whole lot of debate around what it was, how it operated, and what the outcome might look like, except for that it would be in a completely different time horizon. Some of the signals that we gathered for the second one, including digital identity, which, if you're not familiar with digital identity, it's just the idea that in a national database, you basically have a digital identity profile, as opposed to having paper cards and other paper systems. This had been deployed in large countries like India and Croatia. And we did a massive study looking at over 100 different use cases and over 10 countries, Brazil, UK, US, and trying to see how did digital identity play out. And so we kind of mapped that across with ideas of data interoperability. So using data, not just personal data, but social data and medical records and a lot of other data. Right now, things like medical record data is sort of, you can't really share it across with certain institutions because of policy issues. But what if some of those policy borders broke down and we could find a use for it? On-demand artificial intelligence, which is just really fast AI, new recognition devices and sensors, and then biome and gene therapy. So gene therapy had already sort of matured through the Human Genome Project, but we were also seeing a lot of information on biome therapy, the connection between the brain, nervous system, and the gut. And there was actually a lot of potential around that science and really trying to understand how bacteria works. And there's a lot of potential for solving things like autism and depression. And so we looked at all of these different signals and kind of combined them and using the process. And we would do this on our 20% time every other week or so. We get together for a few hours and just kind of map things out and then go through the methods. We did a lot of quantitative research as well, tried to understand how much market investment was happening in each of these fields and technologies. And this may just seem like a slide with a bunch of large numbers, but we wanted to show that there was some credibility around the investment in these areas to show that this is something that could actually happen. But at a consulting firm like this, data was really important to show as sort of an evidence or confidence pillar. So with all of that, we came up with this idea called omnibiotic health systems, and proposed that in the next 5 to 7 years, we were actually looking out maybe like 10-year time horizon. But again, as sort of a marketing campaign or tactic, we wanted to try and show that it was a little bit closer. Not arbitrarily, but we are trying to figure out, like, how can we make this something that people might believe and not feel like it's too far out that they can touch. So we tried to kind of reframe some of the calculations so it kind of felt a little bit nearer. And again, we used the same template that we had used for the first one, where we created an ecosystem of products, created this little isometric diagram, and really kind of speculated on some of the products that might appear. And we tried to kind of balance it between something that felt realistic and something that kind of just pushed the boundaries of the imagination, such as maybe the biome output data toilet, the laundromat that might be able to collect data from DNA. And all of this is based on real technology. We talked to a lot of healthcare professionals and consultants who are working for healthcare clients, but also medical doctors. And we did actually gather a lot of information that inspired some of these ideas. And so what if all this information through all these different types of sensors that were being used could be channeled in through some advanced AI system, and that information could be used by the governments and insurance agents and even consumer products to create new products that were based on biomic systems. This report, or this newsletter, was created in 2020, and it became a little bit sensitive because we were dealing with a pandemic, and the idea of, and we wanted to put this out, but the idea of governments working with data and thinking about health systems and stuff became a little bit sensitive, and so we had to be very careful about some of the ideas and not push it too far. Because again, this was something that we really wanted to use as a platform to talk about the process and show examples that weren't too scary or off-putting for some of our partners or even our clients. Here's just a selection of biome-enhancing drinks, some prenatal care drinks, some that were focused on like zip codes. What if you could actually understand through data coming from a zip code in a region, what sort of viruses or allergens might be in the area, and could you actually deploy drinks or other types of food systems into that area very quickly to deter it from getting worse. The one that was kind of weird and really kind of pushed the boundaries was the one on the bottom left here, the gut celebrity. So what if we could actually measure experiences of celebrities and actually package those experiences through, we don't know what the science was, but if we could actually package that experience into some sort of bottled drink, could you actually relive an experience that a celebrity had at another point in time? The omnibiotic restaurant. So what if you could actually go to a restaurant and put this device in your mouth, which would measure your internal biomic signature, couple that with other data that you might have about the customer, profile, dietary needs, all that stuff, and then information could get sent back to the kitchen, and you would have a menu that's kind of bespoke just for that customer. So we're really trying to find a lot of different ways, and a lot of this seems kind of consumer focused. And also it's just sort of a fun project for us to kind of speculate on new products. And then finally, this is the microbiome spray. We had a designer who was really interested in consumer packaged goods. And we came up with this idea of what if you were getting prepared for a job and you want to kind of enhance your alcohol resistance or social dynamics, be a little bit more extroverted and have a little bit of mental clarity. Could you actually just go and spray this thing in your mouth, and you would actually have all of those abilities, superpowers. And so all of that, that got distributed and got a lot of attention, and we got the attention of some partners and senior partners, and we actually wanted to do another project internally. So during 2020, we were very, very concerned about our healthcare clients reopening or sustaining through the pandemic. So we did a project, and we gathered about 30 different designers, and we went through the entire process where we did trend scanning, we did scenario work, we did implications, and when we came up with a couple of thought starters for our clients. And it's just kind of showing you, we again interviewed medical doctors and other consultants, did some mapping, some scenario cards. And then I'm showing this card because it was kind of interesting that this was one of the cards where we were looking at what if the cases increased, but a treatment or vaccine is available, which actually mirrored what happened in later on that year when the Omicron and Delta virus came out as well. So again, not to say that, yeah, we used this and we predicted the future, but what we're trying to do is show our clients that, hey, we are enabling and employing this process, and we can help you look into the future, not just the far future, but also the near future. So a lot of what I've been doing over the years is really trying to test the waters to see how can we actually use this for long-term planning, long-term visioning, as well as showing near-term results. So in the end, we didn't want to come up with the speculative idea for our customers. We wanted to have a thought starter for them to say, you might want to think about this for the next 6 to 18 months, but also we've also looked at the next 2 to 5 to 7 years, and here's some of the ideas that might want to stimulate new product ideas for you. And then we shop that around to our clients. And I think that's all I've got.
Okay, thank you. It was great. It really sort of piqued my interest, how to, like, when you're doing this kind of projects, what are the key challenges you're facing? Like, how do you translate a speculative design project or concept into an actionable outcome or insight? Like, how do you bridge that gap between speculative imaginaries and reality? Could you, like, elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, and I think that the mantra, which I just said, was really just to try and use it to create the long-term vision, no matter what the time horizon is. But to get to that long-term vision, it's no different than any other business strategy that we're planning. We are just coming up with a goal that's somewhere in the future, and to get to that goal, we have to backcast into the present to figure out how we're going to get there. And all the while also recognizing that, yes, the future changes every day and that vision might change as well, but we have to have a North Star. And so vocabulary was the most important thing, is framing it correctly so that people will understand, whether it's through data, whether it's through showing them the process, but also showing them that this is a thing that is actually attainable.
Okay. So do you ever have, like, because now I'm just curious, like, but have you ever been in a project that has, instead of just being a vision, that it might have turned into something that's more tangible? Like,
Yeah, and in some of the early attempts to bring this into GE, when I was working a lot with airlines who actually have a lot of long product cycles, whether it's through software or building a jet engine, it was sort of the right platform for us to bring it in because we're doing long-term planning as well. And of course, the outputs were not as creepy or imaginative, but we were really looking at, like, what does the airport of the future actually look like 2 to 5 years from now? What are the technologies that we're enabling, that we see that are in development now, and trying to be realistic about it. And some might say, like, well, that's just design strategy. Well, I think it's the same thing. All it is we're trying to give you a vision of the future. It doesn't exist yet. And this is why I'm going back to what Cameron Tunkenweiss said. It was like, it's all just design. We're just finding other ways to look at it, whether it's through provoking a new conversation about what's necessary or actually making that into the North Star. And I think and again, this is sort of my own campaign that I've been the hill that I'm probably going to die on, is that this is a very usable, practical process. And yeah, it kind of pushes boundaries and pushes emotions, but we can use it to create the future we want today.
and I think that now I'm also speaking from my own experience, but for example, here at CIFS, we work with all things futures, but a lot on future studies and within the field of foresight. And I think foresight is something that a lot of companies know of and might even have someone working with. So would you say, like, design or design futures sort of complement or intersect that field? Like, what can we learn to bringing more design into our own practice?
Yeah, and I'm also trying to figure out a way to articulate that better, but I would be doing design a disservice if I said it's only to visualize the future, because it's not. There's a lot of, like Tobias said, there's engineering, there's anthropology, there's social behavior. There's a lot there's a lot of science that goes into design. And so when you envision the scenarios or the future worlds, how can we think about what are the products and services that we need? Well, we have a whole toolkit available to do that. We're just doing it in a different time period, and the context is different. And we actually have lots of different information we can still pull from. It's sort of not any different from designing for the immediate tomorrow, just the environment and the conditions are a little bit different.
That's interesting. And you mentioned toolkit, which means I'm a bit curious, like, how, when you're sort of embarking on this journey into a sort of future design project or design futures project, like, how do you pick what tools to use? Like, do you have any advice on that? Like, how do you select which methods you're going to go into for each project? Do you have a guide?
Yeah. Yeah, I have a bunch that I could choose from. I mean, I still use prompt cards a lot, much like the Stuart Candy's The Thing from the Future. But there's also experiential futures, which both Stuart Candy and Jake Dunnigan had started like many years ago. Immersive Environments Extrapolation Factory does this really well as well. But there are also traditional design brainstorming tools that you can use. I think the difference is you sort of have to put people into that world in the future and make sure that they sit there and look around and understand what the laws and rules are at this point, whether speculative or not, and then employ traditional brainstorming and ideation methods to figure out like what might these people need, what might be necessary, or what happens. How do we take this potential policy question and look at it in terms of a product or service?
And I think that's actually a great transition into our Q&A for our audience. We have a question from Julia. Do you use any kind of technique to warm up before brainstorming sessions in order to leave behind sort of the preconceptions or the assumptions you have to get sort of ready to speculate? Like, how do you, I guess, leave the present to move yourself into the future mentally, in a sense?
I mean, I guess, are you asking me?
Yeah, I'm asking you.
For both of us. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I've always been a believer, and as I've done this process, is if you're walking with people through this process, and you're gathering trends, and you're synthesizing them, and prioritizing them, and you're building the scenarios with them, they will automatically be in the future with you. And if you're inviting new stakeholders and new people, you're going to have to find some way to ramp them up and put them in that world. But there's a belief system that has to be created for each scenario, each world that you're in. And that's one way of doing it. They have to really understand that they're there so they can actually comment and give feedback and participate.
Okay, thank you so much, Phil. And I think now actually it's a sort of a perfect way or time to bring back Tobias into the conversation, because I think it's been really interesting to hear about your work and how you have approached this field, and to me it's become a bit more tangible on how you can approach design futures from through different projects, because it is kind of a, I would say, fluffy field. It's a lot of different ideas, a lot of different concepts, but it's been great to actually see how you have done it. So my final questions to the both of you, we could start with you, Phil, would be, if we have anyone in the audience with us right now who would like, or thinking about this, I would really like to start to explore this field, interesting in sort of starting to actually work with it. Do you guys have any advice on how you start?
I actually get that question a lot. People are always reaching out to me on LinkedIn and really fascinated with the field, and they're like, how do I get a job as a speculative designer? Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of speculative designer job positions open out there. I wish there were, or design futurist positions. And so what I recommend is going and studying, getting some certification in Foresight, going back to school and learning about design futures, and just keeping in mind the tools and frameworks, and just go and be a designer, but bring with that the capability to have a strategic lens on the future. And it'll make you a lot stronger of a designer, and also allow you to be involved in more strategic conversations. And hopefully you'll get something where you can actually bring the process in and not have to cover it up by saying, it's strategy and vision, it's not speculative design or design fiction. You can actually bring this into your work.
Tobias?
I think I've got two answers. It depends who's asking, right? If it's a designer who's asking and wants to know, how do I do this stuff in my job? I think it's, you have to find champions around your organization that can support you, that you can prove the value of it to, and you can show that. And certainly Arup, there are people who really get it and will always push it to the front and give it a real platform. And that's a real benefit, because fundamentally Arup's a design firm, so everyone has a sort of rudimentary understanding of design. And the flip side of it, it's interesting. A lot of the questions have been sort of the note of the type of, what's the tool, what's the thing I do? And I think if you speak to any designer or design researcher, they'll tell you that design is an experience practice. It's not one that you can just teach, no matter what certain American universities think with their 2-week summer schools. You actually have to learn it by doing it, in the same way that you can't teach someone to ride a bike or steer a tugboat. It just comes through practice. And a lot of the quality design work, whether in speculative design or furniture or product, whatever, comes from people who just have an intuitive understanding of how people work, how materials work, how ideas work, how to put ideas into materials so that people can understand them. And that's not something you can pick up with a toolkit, really. There are certain things you can do, and we've mentioned some great practitioners who have released toolkits to help you, and we're actually planning on doing that as well. But really, fundamentally, just speak to a designer who has practice and experience and can articulate those things in a way from their experience. Just with good futures practitioners. It just comes from practice. It's not something you can just pick up, unfortunately.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I started as an architect and now I work with futures, and that has been kind of, starting with my thesis and then moving like through it, and then I ended up here, and so also like you just have to start, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the value that one of the reasons, this is my own thesis, but one of the reasons I think that design is increasingly valuable to organizations, whether in this stuff or like so-called design thinking, is this idea that design is a legitimate form of play, like and therefore like organizations see it as putting some sort of structure and rigor around this idea of just experimentation, intuition, testing, all that sort of stuff, in a way that if you just said, like there are some organizations obviously like Lego that literally just put that front and center because it's part of their ethos. But I think there's something about the idea that designers are captive intuition. That's what they are. They're just captive intuition in a human shaped bottle. That's why it's valuable. But you've got to approach it on those terms. You can't approach it with like, okay, give me the PDF that makes me a great designer, because it just doesn't work.
And I think by that, the time is up for our seminar. And I want to thank you both. It was been so great to have you, and for taking the time to share your perspectives and your work on design futures. And I think there are some things that I personally would sort of take with me from this session. And it is that there are many ways of approaching this field. There is no right or wrong. You can do it through many different types of projects. But I think what maybe is most important, for me at least, is the sort of notion that maybe we should allow ourselves to dream a little, to imagining something different. And I think that is a very good notion to sort of end up with. So with that, I want to say a big thank you to our audience for tuning in. Our next future seminar is coming up in August, and it will actually be on our next theme of our magazine Foresight, Food Futures, where we will explore the cultural, technological, and societal shifts in how and what we eat. So keep an eye out on the Institute channels for more information. And by that, we have reached the end. It's been great having you. And thanks again for tuning in. And if you have any questions or you want to continue this conversation, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We would love to talk more to you.